Good evening. My name is Earl Thomas, retired historian, artist, and painter. Today we will be exploring the eccentric world of tailors during the medieval period. Ease into your most comfortable attire, dim the lights, and enjoy this story. The first light of dawn spills across the crooked rooftops of a medieval town. The streets below stir with early movement. A baker opening his shutters, a cart creaking over the cobblestones. A church bell tolling in the distance. In one narrow house, above a small shop, lies the world. The workshop smells faintly of wool and waxed thread. Shears rest on a bench, needles gleam faintly in the light, and bolts of cloth, some coarse, some shimmering with rare dye, wait patiently for the day's work. In the medieval world, clothing is more than protection from the elements. It is a language of status, wealth, profession, and faith. The garments cut and sewn in this workshop carry meaning as deep as any spoken word. A noble's doublet is stitched to display dignity and authority. A merchant's cloak signals respectability. A farmer's patched tunic whispers of toil and endurance. The tailor stands at the crossroads of necessity and desire, shaping how people are seen by others. The life of a tailor blends practicality with artistry. Clients bring bolts of fabric, coins, or even goods for barter. Each transaction a small reflection of medieval economy and community. The poor bring garments to men, the wealthy commission new gowns and the latest fashions, and the church requests robes fit for procession. Every request demands skill, attention, and sometimes diplomacy, for the tailor must navigate not only fabric and thread, but also the expectations of people from every walk of life. The tools of this craft are humble yet precise. Heavy shears, sharp needles, cords for measuring, chalk for marking, thimbles and pins. In skilled hands, they transform wool, linen, and silk into clothing that reveals as much about society as it does about the individual wearer. With every cut and stitch, the tailor works at the boundary between the ordinary and the symbolic. This is not a solitary trade. The tailor's livelihood depends on a network of weavers, dyers, and merchants. The guild oversees rules of practice. Apprentices learn under strict discipline, and fashions ripple across regions, demanding that the tailor keep pace with the change. Each finished garment is both a personal achievement and a thread woven into the fabric of the town itself. Imagine the rooster crowing outside your window just before dawn. You rise slowly, for the bed is hard, the straw mattress lumpy beneath your back. The chill of the morning air makes you shiver as you reach for your clothes, which you stitched yourself, of course, with neat seams and a fit that speaks of your craft. You splash your face with cold water from a basin and pull on your tunic, ready to begin your day. The streets outside are already stirring. Bakers push open their shutters to sell loaves, still steaming from the oven. A peddler shouts his wares, hoping to make the first sale of the morning. You pass these familiar sounds as you make your way to your workshop, perhaps a small space attached to your home, or a stall rented near the marketplace. Inside it is dim and quiet, waiting for the hum of activity to begin. Your work as a tailor is tied inseparably to fabric. Without cloth, there is no craft. The weavers provide you with wool, spun and woven into sturdy material. The dyers dip their vats, transforming plain cloth into hues that speak of wealth or humility. The merchants bring in fine imports, Italian velvets, Flemish woolens, silks from the East. Each fabric carries its own character, its own possibilities. Wool is the foundation of medieval clothing, for it is abundant and versatile. From thick cloaks to fine tunics, wool can be made coarse or refined, depending on the breed of sheep and the skill of the weaver. Linen, too, is essential, used for undergarments, shirts, and linings. It breathes in summer, offering relief from the heat, though it wrinkles easily. Dyes transform these fabrics into statements of status. The deep blue of woad, grown in northern fields, marks a cloak as costly. The rich reds of madder or kermes, derived from tiny insects, speak of wealth. Green comes from mixing blue and yellow, though it is less stable and often fades. The most prized dye of all is purple, once reserved for emperors, a color so costly it is rarely seen except in church vestments or on the garments of the highest nobility. Each color carries meaning. A servant in dull browns and grays is invisible in a noble's hall, while the noble himself blazes in bright colors that declare his power. The church, too, uses color with care. White for purity, red for martyrdom, black for humility. As a tailor, you must understand not only how to shape fabric, but also how color shapes perception. Sometimes your customers bring you their own cloth, dyed and woven to their taste. Other times, they trust you to select it. You must know which fabric suits which garment, which dye will endure, which weave will hang gracefully. To cut the wrong cloth for the wrong garment is to invite disappointment. And a disappointed customer is a dangerous thing in a small town where reputation is everything. So you learn to feel the weight of wool, to judge the fineness of linen, to marvel at the shimmer of silk. You learn to see not only what the fabric is, but what it might become. A bolt of wool becomes a cloak to shield against the cold. A length of linen becomes a shirt, fresh and clean. A strip of silk becomes a trim that catches the eye. Fabrics and dyes are more than materials. They are the palette with which you paint, the foundation upon which your craft rests. Without them, there is nothing to cut, nothing to stitch, nothing to bring to life. On the tailor's workbench rests an array of instruments that seem modest at first glance, yet carry centuries of tradition. The heavy shears, polished by use, gleam faintly in the workshop light. With each cut, they shape fabric into the beginnings of garments. Needles, sharp, are kept safe in small cases of leather or wood, for their value is too great to risk losing. A single well-made needle can mean the difference between steady work and halted progress. Thread is prepared with care, often coated in wax, to give it strength and smoothness. The tailor's hands grow accustomed to its feel, and the way it binds fabric together with durability that can withstand months or even years of wear. Measuring cords, marked with knots or ink, provide the proportions needed to cut fabric to fit a body. Chalk and charcoal leave pale lines upon cloth, a guide that must be followed with absolute precision, for once the shears close, cloth cannot be restored. Other tools lie ready at hand, awls to pierce holes for lacing, thimbles to protect fingers, pins to hold seams before the final stitch. The bench and stool themselves become part of the craft, worn smooth by years of use. Each tool is simple, yet together they form the foundation of a trade that shapes society's appearance. The mastery of these tools is not instant. Apprentices fumble with needles, prick their fingers, and produce uneven seams. Yet over time, the tools seem to merge with the tailor's hand. An experienced craftsman can judge a straight line by sight, sense the weight of fabric by touch, and move shears through cloth with an ease born only of long practice. Tools do not merely assist the tailor's work. They embody the bridge between imagination and reality, between the request of a client and the garment that will clothe them. Each piece of iron, wood, or wax carries with it the weight of the tailor's reputation, for poor workmanship is remembered as clearly as fine skill. The tailor's world revolves around fabric. On the shelves of the workshop lie bolts of wool, rolls of linen, and on rarer occasions, precious lengths of silk. Each material carries its own qualities and its own destiny in the hands of the tailor. Wool, abundant and versatile, can be coarse for sturdy cloaks or refined for fashionable gowns. Linen, woven from flax, serves for undergarments and linings, valued for its coolness against the skin. Silk, shimmering and smooth, speaks of wealth and distant trade, its presence a reminder of the far-reaching connections of medieval commerce. No fabric is complete without color, and dyes bring life to plain cloth. Oil produces deep blues, while madder yields rich reds. Cochineal and kermes, made from tiny insects, create brilliant scarlets, treasured by the wealthy. Greens appear through mixtures of dyes, though they often fade more quickly than other hues. Purple, costly and rare, remains the color of the highest nobility and the church. Color is not simply decorative. It communicates meaning. Browns and grays suggest humility or poverty, while bright hues declare wealth and status. The church uses colors symbolically in vestments: white for purity, red for martyrdom, black for penitence. Tailors must understand these associations to advise their clients wisely. A tailor's skill is measured not only in the neatness of stitches, but also in knowledge of fabric. Choosing the wrong material for a garment could result in discomfort or wasted expense. The cloth must suit the purpose. Heavy wool for an outdoor cloak, light linen for summer wear. Through fabric and dye, the tailor paints with texture and color, shaping garments that both protect and proclaim. Each fold of cloth carries within it the potential to become part of someone's story, transformed by the tailor's hand from raw material into a symbol of identity. In the medieval world, clothing was not only a matter of comfort or protection, it was a language of hierarchy and belonging. A glance at someone's tunic, cloak, or gown revealed who they were, where they stood in society, and even what they were permitted to wear by law. The tailor was therefore not merely a craftsman, but also an interpreter of social codes, ensuring that the garments he created aligned with the wearer's station in life. For the nobility, fashion served as a declaration of wealth and power. Rich fabrics, imported dyes, and elaborate cuts all spoke of privilege. A nobleman's doublet might be lined with fur and fastened with gilded buttons, each detail proclaiming his ability to afford luxury. Noble women draped themselves in gowns with long, flowing sleeves that trailed dramatically behind them, impractical for work, but perfect for courtly display. These garments were statements designed to remind everyone of their elevated rank. Merchants and burghers occupied a different tier. They were prosperous but not aristocratic, and their clothing reflected a balance between respectability and ambition. A merchant's cloak might be of fine wool, dyed in a rich color, but it would not carry the extravagance of a noble's attire. Too much luxury could invite resentment or accusations of overstepping one's place. Tailors serving such clients had to find a middle ground, clothing that displayed success without provoking envy. For peasants and laborers, fashion was nearly non-existent. Their garments were practical, often patched and mended until the fabric could no longer hold a stitch. Earth tones dominated their wardrobes, not out of choice, but because natural dyes produced such shades cheaply. A tailor working for poorer clients spent much of his time repairing rather than creating, making old garments last through another season. Yet even on the poor, clothing communicated meaning. A cloak that lasted years showed resourcefulness, and a well-kept tunic even if simple, reflected personal pride. Church also influenced fashion, both through symbolism and regulation. Clerics wore distinctive robes, their simplicity meant to contrast with the splendor of secular garments. Monks in their rough habits, nuns in their veils, and priests in liturgical vestments all reminded society of spiritual order. Tailor, when commissioned by religious institutions, worked not in the service of vanity, but of solemn ritual, crafting garments that embodied purity, devotion, or authority. Sumptuary laws added yet another layer to the tailor's task. These laws dictated who could wear what based on rank and wealth. They restricted certain colors, fabrics, and decorations to particular classes. A commoner caught wearing silk or ermine risked punishment, and the tailor who provided such clothing could also face consequences. These laws kept social boundaries visible, turning fashion into a regulated marker of hierarchy. The tailor's skill, therefore, included not only cutting and stitching, but also an awareness of the invisible lines he must not cross. Fashion was never static. Styles shifted from one decade to the next, influenced by distant courts and traveling merchants. Narrow sleeves widened into billowing forms. Short tunics lengthened into flowing gowns. Each new fashion spread slowly outward, first to the nobility, then to the wealthy merchants, and finally, in simpler forms, to the lower classes. A tailor needed to stay aware of these shifts, for to fall behind meant losing the trust of customers eager to keep pace with changing tastes. Thus, clothing became a visible map of society. Every seam and stitch reflected a person's place in the medieval order, from noble courts to humble field. Tailor was the hand behind that map, shaping fabric into symbols that made hierarchy visible to all. No tailor stood entirely alone in the medieval world. The trade was bound together by guilds, organizations that oversaw training, standards, and competition within towns and cities. To belong to a guild was to belong to a community of craftsmen who shared not only a profession, but also mutual obligations, privileges, and protection. Guilds maintained order in a trade that could otherwise become chaotic. They set rules about who could open a shop, how many apprentices one could train, and what standards of quality must be upheld. In any towns, no tailor could legally sell garments without being a member of the guild, ensuring that the craft remained in the hands of recognized practitioners. Apprenticeship formed the heart of this system. A boy, often at the age of 12 or 13, would be bound to a master tailor for several years. During this time, he learned the craft from the ground up, threading needles, cutting scraps, fetching materials, and slowly practicing stitches under the master's supervision. Apprentices lived in their master's household, subject to discipline and bound by oath to serve faithfully. They received little pay, for their true reward was knowledge and the hope of one day becoming journeymen. After years of training, an apprentice could advance to the rank of journeyman. At this stage, he was free to work for wages, often traveling from town to town in search of experience and opportunity. Journeymen refined their skills, observed new fashions, and built reputations. Some remained journeymen for life, while others aspired to become masters themselves. To achieve that status, they often had to present a masterpiece, a garment that demonstrated their ability to cut, sew, and finish to the highest standard. The guild also regulated competition. Prices for garments were sometimes set to prevent undercutting. The quality of work was inspected, for a poorly made garment reflected badly on the entire guild. Fines or punishments could be imposed on those who broke the rules. At the same time, guilds provided mutual aid. Members supported one another in times of sickness, contributed to funerals, and sometimes even participated in charitable acts for the community. Tailors' guilds often had a social and religious dimension as well. They maintained altars in churches, celebrated feast days, and organized processions through the town. These public displays reinforced their collective identity, reminding townsfolk of the tailor's role, not only as craftsmen, but as respected members of society. For the tailor, guild membership was both a privilege and a burden. It brought protection and status, but also responsibility and limitation. The guild stood as both gatekeeper and guardian, shaping the course of a tailor's life from apprenticeship to mastery. Every tailor's workshop was a crossroads of society. Customers of every rank and background passed through the door, each bringing their needs, personalities, and expectations. For the tailor, dealing with people was as important as handling fabric. The garment produced was only part of the exchange. The relationship with the client shaped the success of the trade. The poor came with humble requests. They brought worn garments in need of mending, cloaks to be patched, or shirts to be reinforced at the seams. Payment might not always come in coins. Instead, the tailor received eggs, grain, or even simple promises of labor. These exchanges kept community ties strong, and though the work brought little profit, it ensured loyalty and goodwill among neighbors. Merchants and townsfolk sought more refined clothing. They wanted garments that displayed prosperity without extravagance, respectable enough for church and market, yet comfortable enough for daily life. These clients demanded both practicality and style. A merchant's wife might ask for a gown with modest decoration, or a prosperous craftsman might commission a fine cloak dyed in rich colors. The tailor had to balance cost and fashion, ensuring the garment enhanced the client's social standing without exceeding it. Nobility required the most skill and diplomacy. A noble's order was not simply a request, but a statement of identity. Such clients brought expensive fabrics. Mistakes could not be tolerated. A sleeve cut too short, a seam that sat awkwardly, or a style that had fallen from favor could damage not only the client's pride, but the tailor's reputation. Serving the nobility demanded knowledge of fashion trends, skill in design, and tact in dealing with powerful personality. The church also provided important commissions. Priests, monks, and nuns required garments for both daily use and religious ceremonies. These orders varied from simple habits of rough cloth to richly embroidered vestments for the altar. In crafting these garments, the tailor entered into the sacred, producing clothing that carried spiritual as well as social meaning. Each client interaction was a negotiation, balancing expectation, resources, and social codes. A skilled tailor was not only a craftsman, but also a listener, advisor, and sometimes mediator. He read not only measurements of chest and waist, but also the desires and ambitions of the person before him. The tailor's workshop thus became a mirror of society itself. Every class, every role, every ambition passed through its door, leaving behind a garment that carried the mark of both tailor and wearer. A garment in the medieval world was more than fabric stitched together. It was an attempt to mold cloth to the human body, to transform flat material into a living form. The tailor's greatest skill lay not only in sewing, but in shaping. A cloak that dragged on the ground, a tunic that pinched at the shoulders, or a gown that hung awkwardly could shame a client and ruin a reputation. Fit was everything. Fit was everything. Unlike the modern tailor who works with paper patterns, the medieval craftsman relied largely on experience, instinct, and simple tools. A measuring cord wrapped around the waist, chest, and arm provided the foundation. Chalk marks on fabric guided the shears. But beyond these, the tailor used his eye and hand, judging proportions and anticipating how the fabric would drape when worn. Centuries of tradition shaped these methods, passed down from master to apprentice. The cut of a garment changed with fashion. In earlier centuries, clothing tended toward loose and flowing forms, requiring less shaping. A tunic might be cut wide, gathered with a belt, and adjusted by the wearer. But as the Middle Ages progressed, styles grew more fitted. Doublets and gowns followed the lines of the body, sleeves narrowed, and seams were used not only to join fabric, but to sculpt it. This required precision and innovation. Pattern making became a subtle art. Tailors learned to cut fabric in curved shapes that, when sewn together, followed the body's contours. Gore's triangular inserts were used to widen skirts or sleeves without wasting cloth. Pieces had to be arranged on fabric with care, for cloth was expensive and mistakes unforgivable. The tailor's skill lay in maximizing use of the fabric while achieving the desired form. The process often involved multiple fittings, particularly for wealthy clients. The tailor draped the unfinished garment on the customer, pinching seams, adjusting lengths, and marking changes. Each alteration refined the shape, transforming raw cloth into a garment that seemed to belong to the wearer. For the nobility, fit carried symbolic weight. A gown that displayed a lady's figure with elegance, or a doublet that gave a lord the appearance of strength and control, was as much a weapon in courtly competition as a sword. The tailor thus shaped not only clothing but identity itself. Fit and pattern making demanded patience. The apprentice learned through trial and error, cutting small scraps before daring to handle costly cloth. The master's eye guided the hand, correcting crooked lines and teaching the delicate balance between snugness and comfort. Over time, Tailor internalized these lessons until every cut of the shears carried confidence. In the medieval tailor's workshop, pattern making was both science and art. It combined measurement and mathematics with intuition and creativity. It was the moment when imagination took form, when flat cloth began to resemble the human body. And it was this ability, above all, that distinguished the skilled tailor from the ordinary stitcher. Cloth connected the medieval tailor to a world far larger than his workshop. Every bolt of fabric carried a story of trade and movement, stretching across towns, regions, and continents. To handle silk was to touch the distant east. To cut fine Flemish wool was to feel the handiwork of craftsmen from across the sea. The tailor's scissors divided not only fabric, but also threads of global commerce. Local production formed the base. Sheep grazed in English pastures, their wool spun and woven into sturdy cloth. Flax grew in fields, transformed into linen by laborious processes of retting, spinning, and weaving. These local fabrics served the needs of peasants and townsfolk, providing affordable and practical garments. But the wealthy demanded more. Flemish towns like Ghent and Bruges produced woolens of extraordinary quality, renowned throughout Europe. Italian cities like Florence and Venice supplied velvets and silks, dyed in brilliant color. From even farther came luxuries, silks from Byzantium, brocades from the Middle East, and, through long chains of trade, even fabrics from China. Each carried enormous cost, and each passed through countless hands, merchants, shippers, dyers, and middlemen, before arriving in the tailor's shop. Markets and fairs played a crucial role. Great fairs like those of Champagne in France brought together merchants from across Europe. Tailors or their patrons could purchase fabrics in bulk, choosing from stalls that offered everything from coarse wool to shimmering silks. These gatherings were not only commercial but cultural exchanges, spreading fashions and ideas as well as goods. Traveling merchants introduced new dyes, patterns, and styles. A tailor had to stay informed, listening to gossip of distant courts, observing the garments of strangers passing through town, and noting changes that might soon reach his own customers. Fashion was a current that flowed across borders, and the tailor was one of its conduits. Some tailors themselves traveled, especially journeymen seeking experience. Moving from town to town, they carried skills and styles with them. A journeyman who had worked in Paris might bring new techniques to a workshop in Cologne, blending traditions and expanding the craft's vocabulary. This trade network meant that a gown stitched in a modest town could contain within it the labor of shepherds in England, dyers in Italy, and merchants in the Levant. Taylor's work, though local and personal, was part of a global tapestry of commerce and exchange. The flow of fabric shaped not only clothing but society itself. A noble dressed in Italian velvet signaled wealth not only in coin but in connections. A merchant who could afford Flemish wool displayed his participation in an international economy. Even the humblest garment carried echoes of distant lands, for dyes and techniques spread far beyond their origins. Thus, the tailor stood at a crossroads of local life and global trade. His workshop was small, yet the materials that passed through it tied him to the vast web of medieval commerce. Beyond needles and shears, the tailor lived in the imagination of his society. Tales, proverbs, and plays often mention tailors, sometimes with humor, sometimes with respect, and sometimes with suspicion. These stories reveal how people perceived the craft and its place in the medieval world. Tailors were often portrayed as clever, even cunning. Their ability to transform cloth into fine garments seemed almost magical, a skill that turned humble materials into symbols of wealth. This gave rise to admiration, but also mockery. In some tales, tailors were depicted as tricksters, exaggerating their skills or overcharging clients. Proverbs warned against trusting a tailor's promises, reflecting the uneasy respect people held for those who dealt with appearances. The figure of the 7-at-one-blow tailor became famous in later folklore, celebrated in stories such as The Brave Little Tailor. Though that tale emerged more fully in the early modern period, its roots lay in medieval views of tailors as small but resourceful, underestimated yet capable of surprising strength. Such tales spoke to the common imagination of a craftsman who, though humble, could triumph through wit and skill. Religious symbolism also touched the tailor's world. Clothing carried spiritual meaning, and the act of sewing garments for the church placed the tailor, patched or repaired by repentance, stitched by God's grace. In this imagery, the tailor's work became an allegory for divine craftsmanship. In medieval drama, tailors often appeared as comic characters, their fussing over details exaggerated for laughter. Their concern with fashion and fit became a source of satire, a reminder that appearances could be both important and ridiculous. Yet, even in mockery, their importance was acknowledged. The tailor also embodied the intersection of labor and artistry. Unlike peasants who worked the fields or smiths who hammered iron, the tailor created objects of beauty and display. This set him apart, sometimes admired, sometimes resented. Stories reflected this ambiguity, portraying tailors as figures who straddled the line between necessity and vanity. Through myth and tale, the tailor became more than a tradesman. He was a symbol of transformation, of wit, of the power of appearances. His presence in stories mirrored his presence in society, never central, yet always shaping the fabric of life, one stitch at a time. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones announces the arrival of a royal messenger. His cloak bears the crest of the king, and his words carry the weight of authority. He brings with him a commission. The court requires new garments, perhaps for a coronation, a wedding, or a foreign ambassador's visit. For the tailor, such a summons is not merely an opportunity for work. It is a moment that could elevate or ruin a reputation. Royal courts in medieval Europe were places of spectacle. They were designed to project power, wealth, and stability. Clothing played a central role in this theater, for a king's majesty was judged not only by his actions, but also by the splendor of his appearance. Tailors were the unseen architects of this image. Every robe, every doublet, every embroidered sleeve that appeared at court bore the hand of a skilled artisan. Serving the court demanded the finest materials and the highest craftsmanship. Ordinary wool and simple linen would not suffice. Instead, the tailor worked with velvet, brocade, damask, and silks imported at great cost. These fabrics, often interwoven with gold or silver threads, shimmered in torchlight and candlelight, making courtiers seem otherworldly in their brilliance. Dyes, too, reached their most luxurious extremes. Deep crimsons from kermes, vibrant blues from imported indigo, purples reserved for royalty. To work with such materials was both a privilege and a challenge. A single slip of the shears could destroy cloth worth more than a peasant's yearly wages. The relationship between tailor and king's court was built on trust, discretion, and artistry. The king himself might not meet the tailor often, but his chamberlains, stewards, or master of the wardrobe kept close watch. These officials oversaw the garments of the court, recording orders, inspecting work, and ensuring that the tailor's creations aligned with the king's image. A tailor who proved reliable could receive regular commissions, becoming part of the extended household of the crown. Yet such proximity to power was not without danger. Court politics could be as sharp as a tailor's shears. A misplaced stitch, a garment delivered late, or a gown that failed to impress could sour favor. Tailors had to balance obedience to their royal patrons with their own expertise. A noblewoman might insist on a gown cut in the latest French fashion, while the tailor, mindful of local tradition, might know it would be frowned upon. See was as necessary as skill. Royal clothing served many purposes. At times, it was ceremonial. Coronation robes were heavy with meaning, often embroidered with religious symbols, lined with ermine, and dyed in shades that proclaimed divine authority. At other times, clothing was martial, designed for tournaments and displays of knightly valor. Tailors produced padded garments to be worn beneath armor, surcoats emblazoned with heraldic devices, and cloaks that swirled dramatically on horseback. For feasts and festivals, clothing became a canvas of extravagance. Sleeves that trailed upon the ground, gowns adorned with pearls, hats that defied gravity with their size and ornamentation. The tailor at court was not only a craftsman, but also a custodian of fashion. Trends spread from court to court across Europe, carried by ambassadors, travelers, and noble marriages. What was worn in Paris might soon be demanded in London. What appeared in Milan could become the talk of Bruges. Tailors were expected to keep pace with these currents, adapting foreign styles to local tastes. In a sense, they were silent diplomats of fabric and form, ensuring their patrons appeared both modern and distinguished. There was also a moral dimension to courtly fashion. The church and civic authorities often railed against excess, issuing sumptuary laws to limit who could wear certain fabrics or colors. Yet in practice, royal courts delighted in bending these rules, using clothing precisely to flaunt wealth and distinction. Tailors navigated this tension, producing garments that pushed boundaries without sparking outright scandal. They knew that the line between magnificence and vanity was a thin one, and that their work could become a sermon in silk as easily as an indulgence. For the tailor, courtly commissions brought immense opportunity. Payment might come not only in coin, but also in privilege, exemptions from certain taxes, the right to display their own craftsmanship, even honorary titles. Some tailors achieved fame, their names recorded in household accounts and chronicles. Others worked quietly, their hands shaping history even as their names faded into obscurity. One can imagine the tailor's pride upon seeing their creation unveiled at court. The king descending a staircase in a robe of crimson velvet trimmed with ermine. The queen gliding across a hall in a gown heavy with embroidery. A procession of courtiers dazzling foreign envoys with their coordinated splendor. Each garment was a silent proclamation of the kingdom's strength and refinement, and behind each stood the tailor's steady hand. The relationship between tailor and king's court was thus one of interdependence. The tailor needed the court's patronage for livelihood and prestige, while the court needed the tailor's skill to project its authority and grandeur. Without the tailor, the court would appear drab and ordinary. Without the court, the tailor would lack the stage on which to display mastery. In the quiet of the workshop, away from the clamor of festivities, the tailor might pause to reflect on this bond. Every stitch sewn for the king was a stitch sewn into history. Every robe completed was a fragment of the kingdom's story. Though rarely praised in chronicles, the tailor's work at court ensured that kings looked like kings, and that majesty itself was clothed in fabric. The connection between the tailor and the church was closer than one might assume. Far from being merely a provider of clothes for townsfolk or noble clients, the tailor also played an essential role in maintaining the dignity, authority, and symbolism of the Christian faith. Every robe, every vestment, every stitch carried spiritual weight, for garments worn by the clergy were not simple articles of clothing. They were signs of sacred office, representations of humility, or dazzling displays of liturgical splendor. Consider the monastic habit, worn by Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, and countless other orders. These garments were deliberately plain. They were usually made of wool, undyed or colored in subdued tones such as gray, brown, or black. To sew such a garment was to reflect the very spirit of the order itself: humility, poverty, and devotion. A tailor entrusted with such work was expected not to innovate or embellish, but to honor the principle of simplicity. Yet even this simplicity demanded skill. The cut of a robe determined how it fell, how it allowed the monk to work, to kneel in prayer, to move through cloisters and chapels with ease. At the opposite end of the spectrum lay the priestly vestments used for Mass. Here, the tailor's artistry was displayed at its fullest. The alb, the chasuble, the stole, all these were cut and stitched with precision. They were often made from silk or fine linen, embroidered with gold thread, and colored according to the liturgical calendar: white for feasts, red for martyrs, purple for penitential seasons. Imagine being asked by a bishop to prepare such garments. Your workshop filled with shimmering fabric, your hands guiding delicate stitches that will be seen by an entire congregation when the priest lifts the chalice. In those moments, your work ceases to be mere tailoring. It becomes part of the sacred ritual itself. Church's influence extended further than simple commissions. Tailors' guilds often placed themselves under the patronage of a saint. Saint Helmabonus, a merchant from Cremona, became one of the most popular, a symbol of honesty in trade and devotion to charity. A guild might keep a chapel dedicated to its patron saint, fund candles for the altar, or sponsor processions through the town on feast days. In return, the church gave legitimacy to the guild, blessing its members and marking their craft as a respectable, even holy occupation. For the tailor, this bond was both practical and spiritual. One could see the work of the needle as not just labor, but as a service to God. Yet this relationship was not without its tensions. From pulpits across Europe, priests and friars thundered against vanity and excess. Clothing, they reminded their congregations, was both necessary and dangerous. It could protect the body from the cold, but it could also tempt the soul toward pride. Tailors, as the makers of fine clothes, found themselves caught between these competing forces. The wealthy demanded luxurious robes of velvet, fur, and silk, but the church imposed sumptuary laws that restricted who could wear such things. A tailor who dressed a merchant's wife in garments reserved for the nobility could bring the wrath of both the local authorities and the church itself. Tailors had to tread carefully, balancing the demands of fashion with the warnings of morality. The church was also a powerful patron during festivals and celebrations. On Corpus Christi, or during Easter and Christmas, the streets filled with procession. Guilds marched beneath banners, clergy wore splendid robes, and townsfolk sometimes performed religious plays. Tailors contributed at every level, stitching banners for processions, sewing costumes for biblical characters, repairing church hangings, or outfitting choir boys with robes. These festivals gave the tailor's work a public stage, and though the garments themselves might only last a season, their impact was lasting, remembered by those who saw them shimmering in torchlight or glowing in daylight against the stone walls of the cathedral square. Monasteries too played a unique role in the tailor's life. They were not merely customers, but also producers of textiles. Within their walls, monks and nuns spun wool, wove linen, and sometimes dyed cloth. A tailor might purchase materials from a monastery, or in some cases be hired to work directly with monastic communities. The tailor thus became part of a larger network of religious and economic exchange. A garment sewn for a monk was not simply an item of clothing. It was the endpoint of a chain that included shepherds, spinners, weavers, dyers, and finally, the tailor's hand. Beyond the practical and economic, there was also the symbolic. Clothing held powerful metaphorical value in Christian teaching. Priests spoke of the garment of salvation and the robe of righteousness. To be stripped of one's clothing was a symbol of sin and shame, while to be clothed anew was to be redeemed. Tailors, in this sense, became living metaphors within the society of the Middle Ages. They clothed the body as God clothed the soul. Though rarely acknowledged in sermons by name, their presence lingered in the imagery of religious thought. So what did this mean for the tailor's place in medieval life? It meant that he or she could not escape the reach of the church, nor would one wish to. The church offered patronage, legitimacy, and steady work. In return, the tailor offered skill, materials, and devotion to the symbols that held the medieval world together. To be a tailor in service of the church was to stitch threads not only of cloth, but of society itself, binding together piety, economy, and art into garments that bore both earthly and heavenly significance. Thus, when we think of the tailor's work, we must remember that it was not confined to shops and markets, nor limited to nobles and townsfolk. The church was always present, a quiet but powerful customer, critic, and protector. Each robe for a monk, vestment for a bishop, each banner for a feast day was part of a larger tapestry, the tapestry of faith and daily life. The tailor, with needle in hand, was one of its unseen but essential weavers. Journeymen were apprentices who had completed their initial training yet had not achieved the rank of master. To become a master tailor, one often had to present a masterpiece in a guild hall, demonstrating skill in cutting, sewing, and finishing. However, before this step, journeymen were encouraged, and in some guilds required, to travel from town to town. This was not merely a rite of passage, but a practical method of refining their ability. In each new town, the tailor encountered different fabrics, techniques, and clients' expectations, all of which expanded his knowledge. Traveling tailors carried only the essentials: a bundle of tools, needles, scissors, thimbles, chalk, and a few pieces of cloth or samples. They relied on inns, friends of the guild, or patrons who provided lodging. Their daily lives were a balance between work and survival, negotiating for meals, room, or small commissions along the way. For a journeyman, each new town was both an opportunity and a risk. The mobility of these tailors served several purposes. First, it exposed them to the diversity of fashion across regions. Styles in Paris might differ from those in Cologne or Florence, and wealthy patrons expected their garments to reflect the latest trends. Traveling tailor learned to adapt, observing the cut of sleeves, the drape of gowns, the use of trims, and the colors that were in vogue. This knowledge, carried back to his home workshop, was invaluable. Second, traveling tailors spread techniques and innovations. A method learned in one city, perhaps a more efficient way to cut a sleeve or embroider a hem, could be introduced in another. In this way, fashion and craftsmanship circulated across Europe, moving through the hands of journeymen more effectively than through books or guild statutes. The tailor became a conduit of knowledge, transmitting practical skills and stylistic trends from one region to another. Journeymen faced challenges beyond technical skill. Roads could be dangerous with bandits, inclement weather, and unfamiliar terrain. Towns and cities were governed by local laws and guild regulations, which sometimes complicated a traveling craftsman's work. A tailor without guild membership in a particular town might be forbidden from accepting commissions for certain clients, requiring negotiation or temporary sponsorship from local guild members. Social and political awareness was almost as important as proficiency with needle and thread. Despite these risks, travel offered freedom and opportunity. Journeymen could earn wages in towns where skilled labor was in demand. Sometimes they were invited to work for nobility or wealthy merchants who paid generously for expertise not available locally. In other instances, a traveling tailor might serve smaller communities, mending garments, producing cloaks, or creating simple tunics. Every job, whether elaborate or humble, added to experience and reputation. Life on the road also taught adaptability and resourcefulness. Journeymen needed to work with the materials at hand, often improvising if a particular fabric or dye was unavailable. They learned to negotiate prices, manage time, and maintain quality under pressure. In doing so, they became not only skilled tailors, but resilient and self-reliant individuals capable of navigating a complex social and economic world. The social dimension of travel was equally significant. Journeymen often exchanged stories, techniques, and patterns with other craftsmen. Guild networks could provide support, offering temporary work, lodging, or guidance in unfamiliar towns. Shared meals, workshops, and apprenticeships fostered connections that might last a lifetime. Traveling was not merely a solitary endeavor. It was a method of networking and professional development within the guild system. In some cases, traveling tailors worked on extraordinary commissions. They might be called to a noble court to assist a master tailor in preparing garments for a wedding, tournament, or diplomatic visit. Here, the journeyman observed the highest level of craftsmanship, learning secrets of fit, embellishment, and design that could elevate his work to the status of a masterpiece. For these young artisans, such experiences were transformative, often shaping their careers and future reputations. Through these journeys, the traveling tailor became a vital link between local workshops and the broader currents of medieval fashion. A garment stitched in a small town might reflect influences from distant Persian courts, Flemish weaving techniques, or Italian embroidery patterns, all transmitted through the hands of journeymen. The movement of tailors ensured that innovation and style were not confined to capitals or major cities, but circulated throughout the countryside. Finally, the experience of travel had a lasting personal impact. Journeymen returned to their hometowns, not only with refined technical skills, but with knowledge of different social classes, cultures, and markets. They understood the subtleties of patronage, the expectations of clients, from peasants to nobles, and the delicate balance of fashion, practicality, and status. This awareness enriched their work and strengthened the reputation of the workshops and guilds they eventually joined as masters. Thus, the traveling tailor was more than a wandering craftsman. He was a student, a teacher, a messenger of style, and a participant in the social, economic, and cultural life of medieval Europe. Each journey was a chapter of learning, a test of resilience, and a contribution to the vibrant tapestry of medieval craft. With needle in hand and bundle on his back, he moved not only across landscapes, but also across the ever-shifting currents of fashion, skill, and society. The life of medieval tailor was woven from many threads. In his workshop, the world came together, the humble and the noble, the local and the distant, the practical and the symbolic. Every garment that passed through his hands carried not only fabric and thread, but also meaning, status, identity, faith, and aspiration. Tailor's tools, though simple, demanded skill and care. His fabrics connected him to fields, flocks, and far-off lands. His customers brought him into contact with every layer of society, making him both servant and advisor. The guild bound him to his peers, shaping his path from apprentice to master. And fashion itself demanded constant awareness, for to clothe a community was also to keep pace with change. Yet beyond the work lay the deeper role of the tailor, interpreter of appearances. He shaped how people were seen, how they wished to be seen, and how society perceived them. A patched cloak spoke of endurance, a velvet gown of wealth, a priest's vestment of holiness. In every case, the tailor's stitches gave form to human lives. The tailor also lived in the imagination of his society, appearing in stories, jokes, and allegories, sometimes mocked, sometimes admired. He represented the delicate balance between necessity and vanity, labor and artistry, humility and ambition. Peasants in folklore reminds us that he was more than a tradesman. He was a cultural figure, embodying the power of craft to shape both material and meaning. To step into the world of the medieval tailor is to see medieval life itself, the rhythms of daily work, the networks of trade, the hierarchies of society, the symbolism of color and form. His workshop was small, yet from it emerged garments that clothed peasants, merchants, nobles, and priests alike. His needle stitched not only seams, but also the very fabric of medieval identity. In the quiet of his shop, amid scraps of cloth and the steady rhythm of needle through fabric, the tailor worked at the heart of his community. He was never the loudest figure in town, nor the most powerful, but his craft touched every life, his work visible on every street and in every hall. The tailor reminds us that history is not only written in battles and kings, but also in the quiet labor of hands that shaped how people lived, worked, worshipped, and dreamed.